Every culture on Earth marks the passage of time, but not every culture celebrates it. Because when you strip away the confetti, the countdowns, the champagne, the Planet Fitness marketing, the wearing diapers all day in Times Square, the broken promises that you're going to lose weight, and all this forced optimism that we try to put in ourselves, New Year's Day is not about hope. It's about survival. For as long as human beings have tracked time, we've been deeply uneasy about moments when one cycle ends and another begins. Anthropologists call these moments liminal spaces, which are thresholds where the rules are unclear, where the old protections no longer apply, and the new ones haven't taken hold yet. Doorways, crossroads, twilight, midnight. New Year's Day is the largest liminal space we experience collectively. And historically, people believed that during this moment, this brief pause between what was and what might be, anything can happen. Gods could withdraw protection, chaos could return, the world could end. On this New Year's Day, I want to tell you the long, uncomfortable truth. New Year's Day has always been terrifying, and the only thing that's changed is how hard we work to pretend it isn't. Welcome to Gravely Amusing, the only horror history podcast not brought to you by Planet Fitness. I'm your host, the man-child of the macabre, Bryan Sexy Beast Peters. You know it, baby. And today, on New Year's Day, I want to talk about something that we're all supposed to be celebrating. Unless you're like me and you're just tired and old and you really don't have any plans except pretty much going to sleep. And that is New Year's Day itself. And we celebrate this day because we're told that this is a day about fresh starts, about clean slates, about new beginnings. But if you ever felt like something about today feels kind of off, like the countdown felt hollow, or the optimism felt forced, or the whole thing just carried a weird, quiet dread. And I don't think you're imagining that. I don't think it has to do with Dick Clark not being around because, man, that man made a rockin' New Year's Eve. New Year's Day is actually one of the oldest fear dates in human history. So long before champagne, fireworks, and wearing a diaper all day at New Year's at New Year's Eve at Times Square. Or I saw a TikTok yesterday that had a dude that was using maxi pads to piss in, and he thought they would work. And the female newscaster was like, "Yeah, good luck on that, buddy. Yeah, he's gonna be soaked and smelled and piss. It's gonna be awesome." But anyway, but regardless of all this and resolutions, this was the day people generally believed that the universe itself could completely fall apart. They didn't see this as a day of hope. They saw it as more so a test, a moment where time itself could fail. And that fear didn't start with modern anxiety or social media and trying to get your dopamine hit or like our current burnout culture. It actually started over 4,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. And the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, they didn't believe that time moved forward automatically. They didn't believe the future simply just happened. They believed that time was fragile and something that had to be actively repaired, renewed, and actually negotiated every year. And if that renewal failed, the universe itself would completely unravel. In ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq and one of the very first places humans ever built cities, the new year was not marked by celebration, optimism, or personal goals. It was marked by fear. Because to the people in Mesopotamia, the end of the year meant something completely terrifying to them. It meant the world was beginning to slide back towards chaos, and not like metaphorical chaos, not emotional chaos, but real cosmic gods level chaos. The same chaos that existed before creation even began. So in Mesopotamian mythology, order was not natural. It was not a natural thing to have order at all, to have any set of laws or anything like that. In Mesopotamian culture or Mesopotamian mythology, chaos was natural. And before the world existed, there was a vast, violent, undifferentiated nothing, often personified as monstrous beings like Tiamat, the dragon of primordial chaos. Yeah, really cool shit here. Really cool shit. So Tiamat, the dragon of primordial chaos, like and like creation in their worldview wasn't gentle. It was a violent act of suppression. The gods didn't erase chaos, they pinned it down. And every year that pin that they pinned down loosened, like floods weren't weather to them. Famine wasn't bad luck. Disease wasn't simple biology. They were warnings, signals that the gods were losing their grip, or worse to them, withdrawing their grip. So when a new year approached, Mesopotamians didn't ask, what do I want to do this year? What do I want to accomplish? Will this be the year I lose weight? This be the year I get married or whatever? They asked, will I survive this year? Will the universe itself survive? So the New Year festival that they would have was known as Akitu. I hope I said that right, Akitu. And it's spelled Akitu. Akitu, I believe it is. And it dates back more than 4,000 years. And this festival lasted 12 days. So it was kind of like the 12 days. I guess not the 12 days, well, kind of like the 12 days of Christmas. Only you weren't really, I guess you actually would be overwhelmed by the gifts and things going on. But anywho, every one of those days existed for one reason. And these days and Tiku were to convince the gods not to let the world fall apart. It was not a celebration. It was like a ritualized emergency, and the entire city participated. So you had priests, citizens, soldiers, nobles, your street sweepers, yeah, your girls that work the corner, like everybody was participating because they all understood what was at stake. This was the time where gods would decide whether the crops would grow, whether rivers would flood, whether enemies would invade, whether the king was still worthy, or whether order itself would actually continue. And the most important part of Atiku or Akitu was actually the destruction of the king. And he had to be broken down symbolically and psychologically. So in Mesopotamia, the king was not just a ruler, the king was like the human anchor of cosmic order. And if the king failed, the universe would follow. So during Akitu, the king was brought before the high priest of Marduk, the city's chief god, and everything that defined him was stripped away, like literally. So they removed his crown, they would take off his royal robes, they would take his scepter, which was his symbol of authority, they would confiscate that. He was no longer king, He was just a man. He was just a boy. And then in front of all these witnesses, the priest did something completely awesome. The priest would reach back their hand and slap that hoe and and slapped them very hard. I mean, a huge pimp slap. And the, and and I was raised in the streets, you see, so I know about pimp slaps, as Dre would back me up there. Um, and this wasn't symbolic. Like, this was meant to humiliate the king. And the king was forced to kneel and confess his failures, his injustices, his arrogance, his inability to live up to divine expectations. And here's what mattered most. The priests, after the pimp slap, would watch his face. And because the ritual required the king to cry, he watched it closely. And if the king cried, it meant he was humble, it meant he feared the gods, it meant he acknowledged his inadequacy, it meant that he admitted that he's a bitch. And if he did not cry, it was an absolute disaster. A tearless king meant pride, and pride in Mesopotamian belief was the fastest way to cosmic punishment. A proud king meant the gods might withdraw their protection, they might abandon the city, they might let chaos return. And the fate of the entire year hinged on whether a grown man, publicly humiliated, could be emotionally broken enough to weep. And that's how close they believed annihilation like always was. So if this ritual failed, and this is the part when we often underestimate, Mesopotamians, didn't believe that ritual symbolized order. They believed that it created it. The ritual, if the ritual was like performed incorrectly, if the gods were displeased, if the signs were wrong, then the consequences were very real to them. So historical records actually describe years following a bad Akitu by crop failure. There were epidemics, there was political collapse, there was sudden death of rulers, invasions and sacking of cities. And to them, these weren't coincidences, they were confirmation that the gods turned away. The time itself had not been properly renewed. So if that priest did not bitch slap that king correctly, then time would not reset, that it would not be renewed, and crops would not grow. So that's why it's always proper, if you are in the clergy or anything, that you know how to do the proper pip slap. And I think that we probably as a people should get, any type of religious leaders, be it Buddhist, Catholic, Protestant, Tibetan, if the Tao, whatever, and we just get them all to go to our world leaders, especially one with orange hair, and just completely and utterly just bitch slap the hell out of them. And let's fix the world, everybody. Fix the world with a good old pimp slap. You heard it here, people. And for Mesopotamia's, time could break. The new year wasn't a reset button to them. It was a stress test. Every year humanity stood at the edge of non-existence and asked the gods, are we worth still sustaining? And that fear that the universe only continues because something powerful allows it to never really went. To us. We did stop calling it chaos, we stopped calling it gods, but that anxiety still remains because deep down, humans still know something uncomfortable. We know that nothing guarantees the future. And that's why New Year's Day has always been a moment when kind of like the truth about ourselves feels closest. We look at what we've accomplished through the year. We look at what we want to accomplish. We start to think if we failed ourselves or other people, we start really this huge reflection of who we are. And here's something modern culture kind of gets almost completely backward. You know, we're we're taught to kind of fear endings. You know, we mourn them, we dramatize them, we treat them as lost, or as loss. And like when something just ends in our life, we have that grief time. We have that, you know, the 7 steps of grief or however many it is. Maybe it's 5, I don't know, or maybe it's probably 6 or 7. And you know, ancient cultures didn't fear endings. They feared beginnings because an ending had already proven something important. You know, if you had an ending, you survived it. A beginning, on the other hand, asked a far more dangerous question. Will you survive the thing that comes next? You know, endings are known, beginnings are not. So to ancient people, an ending was concrete. You know, the harvest ended, winter ended, a war ended, a life ended. Those things were tragic, but they were understood. A beginning, however, meant stepping into a future with no guarantees, no patterns yet established, and no proof that order could continue. And that's why across cultures, creation itself is rarely depicted as peaceful. You know, creation is violent, creation is unstable, creation is something that can go wrong. And if creation could go wrong, you know, creation, you know, once went wrong, you know, things new beginnings could go wrong again. So w- so let's look at pattern that appears over and again in ancient mythologies around the world. Scholars call it chaos. Man, I hope I said this right. Scholars call it chaos kumpf. Chaos Clump, which is CHAOSKAMPF. There's people a lot smarter than me that probably can pronounce that with no problem. But scholars call it Chaos Clump. I don't know. Literally, this means the struggle against chaos. And in these stories, creation doesn't happen because the universe wants order. It happens because chaos is defeated, imprisoned, or restrained. In Mesopotamia, Marduk slays Tiamat and builds the world from the dragon's body. In Norse mythology, the giant Ymir is killed and his corpse becomes the world. In ancient Egyptian myth, the god Atum rises from the chaotic waters of Nun and most constantly asserts order. And ancient kind of Eastern myths, you know, chaos monsters are never destroyed. They're only subdued. And the message here is always the same. Order exists only because something powerful is holding this chaos down. And if that force were ever to weaken, chaos would return. This is why beings terrified this is why beginnings terrified ancient cultures, because a beginning wasn't just a start, it was like a reopening of Pandora's box, if you will. You know, a reopening was cosmic instability, it was divine judgment, it was uncertainty. The new year wasn't a celebration of progress. It was a moment when old protections expired, ritual safeguards had to be renewed, the universe briefly stood unguarded. And, and anthropologists call this the liminal period. It's a time when rules don't apply. And liminal periods are absolutely dangerous. So across cultures, liminal times were treated with extreme caution. So examples of that would be, you know, twilight instead of day or night, a crossroads instead of just a simple road, doorways instead of the room itself, you know, birth instead of life, death instead of absence. New Year's Day was the largest liminal moment of all because it was like time itself standing in that doorway. And in doorways, ancient people believed that spirits could enter, that gods could observe them more closely, and that misfortune could slip through. So that's why so many cultures had strict taboos around the start of the year. Like, not because they were superstitious fools, but because they understood how fragile order felt. So some cultures would even go further here. They believed the world had already ended once or almost ended and could do so again. So in Hindu cosmology, the universe is created, destroyed, and recreated endlessly. And in Mesoamerican belief systems, previous worlds were destroyed by floods, fire, or darkness. In many indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories, the world exists because ancestral beings still walk it. And if those paths are forgotten, reality will weaken. In these world views, the universe is not permanent. It's pretty much conditional. And every beginning tests whether these conditions will still hold. So the new year combines two fears at once. It combines the end of a completed cycle and the start of an untested one. So ancient people believe this is when gods would renew human behavior or reviewed human behavior, and moral failures were tallied, order was either renewed or withdrawn. And this wasn't abstract theology, it shaped behavior. People avoided starting conflicts. They avoided speaking ill of others. They avoided risky decisions. They performed rituals with obsessive precision because if you failed at the beginning, you moved forward. But here's the unsettling part: we still operate this way. We still believe like how the year starts matters. So we always start that diet on January 1st. We always try to start that goal to run more on January 1st or, whatever. And first impressions set this tone. And if we have a bad start to our resolution or the year, it, we doom all our good intentions. That's why people have certain rituals that they do. I think like putting pennies in loafers or eating round food or, halushki and cabbage or sauerkraut and pork and all these rituals that we do to try to bless the new year. And we phrase it like momentum, motivation, energy, good vibes. But the fear underneath is the same fear that if you start everything wrong, everything that follows is going to collapse. Anxiety is not modern weakness, it's inherited survival instinct that humans have inherited. And endings can feel safer than beginnings because endings are finite, beginnings are infinite. An ending says, this chapter is over, this book is over. A beginning says, you are responsible for what happens next. And ancient cultures understood something that we often avoid. They understood that beginnings demand accountability, they demand risk, they demand faith, not in optimism, but in continuity. And continuity has never been guaranteed. And we never lost this belief because, this belief never really disappeared because, because we stopped believing in chaos gods or we stopped believing in fear and in fearing chaos, or we stopped believing the universe could collapse because of ritual failure. And we didn't stop fearing that one start could ruin everything. This fear just transferred into anxiety, into having resolutions, into self judgment, into pressure. And New Year's Day still feels heavy because it always was, not because it ends something, but becomes it begins something that might not hold. It begins something that might not last. And for example, when Rome formalized its calendar, it actually did something very telling. It did not name the first month after a god of joy or abundance or victory. It named it after Janus. And Janus is a god, it's spelled Janus, Janus, is a god who embodies one of the most uncomfortable human emotions, which is anxiety about transitions. Giannis is not a heroic god. He has no great battles. He has no epic romances, no dramatic downfall. But what he was, or what he has, is vigilance. Giannis is always depicted with two faces. So the Batman villain, because we have to bring it back to Batman, the Batman villain Two-Face is based very much on Giannis type things. The face of Giannis is depicted with one looking backwards at what has already happened, looking to the past, and one face that's looking forward and as to what has not yet recurred, to the future. One face to the past, one face to the future. And this wasn't artistic flair, it was theology. Giannis ruled doors, gates, thresholds, beginnings and endings, and transitions of every kind. In Roman belief, thresholds were dangerous places. A doorway was not neutral space. It was where the outside met the inside. Safety met threat. Order met chaos. And that's why Roman homes often placed protective shrines near doorways. So they didn't put these protective shrines in bedrooms or kitchens, but at entrances, because entrances were vulnerable. And January was the doorway of the year. Romans didn't fear December 31st. No, no, no. They feared January 1st because December had already proven itself survivable. January had not. Romans believed something deeply unsettling. Beginnings were contagious. The emotional, moral, and symbolic tone of a first day would echo forward. If January 1st was peaceful, the year would be peaceful. If January 1st was violent, the year is going to be violent. If January 1st was chaotic, the year is going to be chaotic. And this wasn't superstition for peasants. This belief was shared by senators, generals, emperors, and priests, and of course, priests with a good bitch slap. The Roman elite were obsessed with omens, and January 1st was omen ground zero. Roman sources describe January 1st as a day requiring extreme behavioral discipline. So people intentionally would avoid arguments. They would avoid shouting or insults. They avoided any legal disputes. They avoided funerals if at all possible. Sorry, Grandma, you can't die today. um, they avoided announcing any bad news because to hear bad news on the first day of the year risk living bad news all year long. And there are accounts of people delaying court cases, delaying public punishment, delaying announcements of death, not because they denied reality, but because timing mattered. Bad things acknowledged on January 1st were believed to be spread. Romans exchanged New Year's gifts, actually, called strene. I hope I pronounced that right. And spelled Strenae, strene. And these weren't Christmas gifts, actually. They were given for joy. They weren't given for joy or affection. They were protective offerings. So common strene included honey for sweetness of the year, sweetness in the year, dates or figs. And if you're my buddy Brandon Lawson, you probably really, really love those dates and figs, and you're all about that. They gave coins for prosperity, and they gave laurel branches for victory and protection. And these gifts were often exchanged at dawn because the first moments mattered the most. A bad interaction early could poison everything that followed. Giving Strene or Strene or whatever was a way of saying, let this year start gently. Let it begin without offense. Let fate be appeased. And back to Giannis here, Giannis was unlike most gods because Giannis did not intervene dramatically. Giannis watched, he observed transitions. And Romans believed Giannis opened the year, guarded its entrance, and watched who passed through and how. And that's why prayers to Giannis prayers to Giannis came before prayers to other gods in Roman culture. If Giannis didn't approve this transition, nothing else mattered. If Roman thought the future didn't open automatically, Giannis had to allow the future. Roman historians loved recording moments when bad beginnings led to disaster. Romans historians loved recording moments when bad beginnings led to disaster. Examples include consuls who assumed office on January 1st and died within the year. Military campaigns begun early in the year and would end in catastrophe. Political reforms launched in January that would collapse violently. Romans didn't treat these as coincidence, they treated them as confirmation. If the year began poorly, it remembered. And January was not neutral time, it was active time. A wrong word spoken, a fight started, a death acknowledged, a curse uttered. These weren't just moments, they were seeds, and seeds grow. And that's why January was approached with caution, restraint, and ritual behavior, not optimism, but caution. Modern people hear this and might think, how irrational. But the psychology here is actually razor sharp. The Roman fear wasn't about magic, it was about pattern recognition. If something begins badly, humans expect it to continue badly. And we still do this. And we just phrase it differently. We say off to a bad start. We're on the wrong foot. This year's already cursed. Next year will be better. And memes are created and whatever, and it sets the tone. And that's Roman thinking, which is still alive today. And why Giannis still matters here is Giannis was not the god of hope. He was the god of attention. He didn't promise a good year. He watched you to watch how it starts. And that's why January can feel tense because deep down, we still believe if we mess this up, the rest will follow. January isn't a blank page, it's a door. And doors have always made humans nervous. And Christianity didn't invent fear for the future either. It refined it. God bless the Christians. Before Christianity, though, most cultures believed time moved in cycles. Seasons returned, worlds renewed, order was repaired again and again. Christianity would break that loop. It introduced a far more unsettling idea. Time was going somewhere, and when it got there, it would stop. Christian theology reframed existence into a single irreversible timeline. This timeline was creation, fall, redemption, judgment, and then the end. There would be no renewal after that end. There was no reset. There was no second attempt. History with Christianity, history became a countdown. And that meant every passing year wasn't just movement, it was approach. The future was no longer uncertain in a neutral way, it was accountable. And after Christianity, the question wasn't just, will the world survive? It became, will you survive? The end of time wasn't cosmic disorder, it was a moral reckoning now. Souls are going to be judged. Deeds are going to be weighed. Salvation is going to be granted or denied. And the blueprint for that ending was laid out in one of the most terrifying books ever canonized, the Book of Revelation. And I know I say this all the time and I never follow through because life gets busy and I really suck as a podcast host, but I think I would really like to do a lot of the Book of Revelation and break that down, probably with my friend Dave and some other people, and really break that down and break down Dante's Inferno. I think it could be a really, really cool discussion. And let me know if you like that. Reach out to me. Let me know what you want me to talk about. But back to the Book of Revelation. Revelation doesn't describe a gentle conclusion. It describes earthquakes. It describes plagues. COVID, anybody? Fire, war, cosmic signs, the dead rising, humanity divided into the saved and the damned. For medieval Christians, most of whom could not read and learned theology through sermons and artwork, this wasn't metaphor. It was inevitable reality. And the calendar would start to matter more. Once time had an endpoint, calendars stopped being practical tools. They started becoming spiritual instruments. And every year closer to the end meant that less time there was to repent, fewer chances to be forgiven of your sins, and greater scrutiny of your behavior. The new year wasn't wasn't symbolic anymore. It was 1 year closer to your judgment, and no one knew how many years were left. In the year 1000, everybody panicked too. The panic was not a myth in the year 1000. For a long time, historians downplayed this fear surrounding the year 1000, but modern study has corrected it. And while panic wasn't uniform anywhere, apocalyptic expectation was widespread and real, especially in Western Europe. Chroniclers, monks, and priests recorded that sermons warning the faithful to prepare for the year 1000. Signs interpreted as omens, which signs interpreted as omens like comets, eclipses, and famines were seen as omens of the end. A growing belief that Satan would be unleashed at the year 1000. The book of Revelation tells us that there was a war in heaven and Satan is in the abyss or hell, if you will, and imprisoned. They believed that Satan would be unleashed in the year 1000. They believed a conviction that Christ's return was imminent at that time. And as the year 1000 approached, people responded the only way that they knew how. You know, and behavior was based on them thinking that time was going to run out. So there were mass confessions of sins. Sometimes entire villages would go to church and and reveal their sins. Donations of land were sent. Wealth and prosperity went to the church because the church is going to save you from the year 1000. So give all your money to the church. Noble families would abandon young long-term plans. Peasants would give up their farms. Pilgrimages undertaken with no expectation of return. And churches were packed, especially around New Year's. January 1st wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a time of joy. It was a vigil. People gather not to welcome the future, but to try to survive it. And if you want proof of how deeply this fear ran, look at medieval art. Look at church walls, manuscripts, stained glass. They are filled with images of the last judgment, of souls being weighed, demons dragging the damned into hell, Christ seated as judge, not a savior. Christ seated as judge, not a savior. And these images weren't decoration, they were instruction. Like most medieval Christians encountered the future visually because they couldn't read. And what they saw was terrifying. Like I mean, Dante's Inferno, all these images drawn of what hell would be and like what you would suffer if you were lustful, if you stole, if you betrayed your friends. Like all these images were created and stuck in people's heads. And when January 1st, 1000, in the year 1000, in the year 1000, nothing happened. It arrived, the world didn't end. There was no trumpet, there was no fire, there was no final judgment. Christ didn't show up, a big dragon didn't come out of the ocean, Satan wasn't released. Nothing happened. But the fear didn't disappear. It would change direction. If the world didn't end externally, maybe the problem wasn't time. Maybe it was people, and the fear would be internalized. Christians would begin to increasingly focus on personal sin, moral purity, on guilt, on constant self surveillance. If judgment wasn't arriving yet, and the judgment didn't arrive in year 1000, that meant that God is still watching me. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance. And time was ticking. Time keeps on ticking. No, time keeps on slipping. Sorry. And behavior still mattered. Every year became a test. Every new year became a reminder. You're still going to be held accountable. And this fear never left us. But this shift is crucial, though, because Christianity didn't remove ancient fear of beginnings, it moralized it. Now, when the year turns, your anxiety isn't, well, the gods abandoned us. It's, am I good enough? Did I waste time this year? What if I don't change the things that are wrong with me? And what if this is my last year? What if this is the last chance I get? And this fear still peaks around New Year's, not because of superstition, but because the idea of linear time plus judgment never has left Western culture at all. Like listen how people talk about New Year's resolutions. I need to fix myself. I can't keep wasting time. I need to publish that novel. I need to lose weight. I need to be a better father, a better a better parent, a better person, a better friend, a better partner, whatever. I'm running out of time, I'm getting older. How much time do I have? And that's not ancient pagan fear. That's medieval Christian anxiety, secularized, internalized, and personalized. The apocalypse didn't vanish. The apocalypse moved inside us. And Christianity promises salvation. It promises salvation, but it also introduced finality, judgment. You get no do over, and you get internal consequences for your actions. So this new year stopped being about renewal. It became about reckoning. And that's why even now, January 1st feels heavy, because deep down, we still feel like we're being evaluated. And how many people, yourself included, do you feel like you're constantly being judged, constantly being evaluated, constantly feel like you're screwing up, that you can't do anything right, that your life is garbage, that nothing's ever going to get right? It's because this eternal apocalypse is in you and you have no hope. And, you know, us, us if time is in a cycle, then you believe you'll get another chance. But linear time says that everything you do counts. There are no second chances. And once you believe you have no second chances, everything is terrifying. Every beginning is terrifying. Every relationship is terrifying. Every day is terrifying. Every action that you do is terrifying to you because you feel like there is no other chances. There is no other fishes in the sea. I'm never going to get that job I want. I'm never going to achieve that dream that I have. nothing good is ever going to come my way. And you're full of fear and you're terrified. And modern psychology explains something that ancient people already understood intuitively. The human brain is not built to be evaluated on command. How about that? New Year's Day is one of the most aggressive evaluation moments that we experience because we reflect in fragments. We think about yesterday, we think about last week, we think about a specific mistake we made, we think about a specific success that that we want to accomplish or we did accomplish, and we're waiting for the next one. What we don't do well as humans is total self assessment, and New Year's Day demands self assessment. Psychologists call moments like this temporal landmarks. It's a point in time that psychology divide life into before and after. So according to research summarized by the American Psychological Association, because you're listening to Bryan, and Bryan studies psychology big time because Bryan is basically Batman. But the American Psychological Association says that temporal landmarks trigger intense self comparison because they feel official. They don't ask you, what am I doing lately? Like, what are you doing currently in your life? You ask, what have I done with my life? So, not what you're doing now, what have you already done? Not what you're accomplishing now, but what you accomplished in the past. And that's a very different question. Those are two very different questions. So on New Year's Day, the brain performs three comparisons almost automatically. You ask yourself who you were, who you are, and who you think you should be. I'll say that again. You ask yourself who you were in the past, all the sins you committed, all the mistakes you made, all the horrible things in your past. And then you think about who you are now. Are you that same person? Are you still making those mistakes? Are you still failing at life? Are you still struggling? Are you still not financially okay? Are you still not achieved your dreams? You think of that now, and then you think of all that you should be. I should be thin. I should be more attractive. I should run. I should eat better. I should treat people better. I should treat myself better. I should go to therapy. I should ask that girl out. I should probably end that relationship that's not really benefiting me, or I should start this new relationship because they're great. And what am I afraid of? You think of all you should be. And this is not really motivational, it's confrontational because the third version, the third line there, who you think you should be is you think you should be younger. You think you should be healthier. You think you should be more successful. You think you should be more stable. Maybe you're thinking, gosh, what am I doing here? Like, I'm just trying to survive. And you think you should be further along in life. There was a time where I just hated myself, and and I kind of still do sometimes. I thought, I should have been a big, a big evangelist in the church and living in London and spreading the gospel to all these people, but mostly just helping people. And that's what I wanted to do. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be a comedian, and now that I'm older, I would love to be an actor and comedian, but I also want to write comic books. I want to write stories. And I look at my life and I'm like, I should be further along. There's more things should have happened. And you think about how you imagine yourself and you realize it's not real. And this abstraction is built from social comparison. It's built from cultural pressure. It's built from unrealistic timelines. Other people's highlight reels. And your brain compares this reality to fantasy, and reality is always going to lose. And here's the critical psychological point here. Motivation works best when goals feel achievable and specific. New Year's resolutions are usually neither. They're vague. I'm going to be better. I'm going to get healthy. I'm going to fix my life. I'm going to stop wasting time. And this vagueness creates anxiety because the brain can't measure that progress. So instead of motivation, the result is shame. I'm not good enough. I'm never going to be good enough. You feel guilt. If I would have made that other decision, if I would have asked that girl out, if I would have asked that man out, if I would have came out and told my parents that I'm gay, or whatever you're dealing with, it's a sense of personal failure, and that fear is that time is slipping away, and that fear has a name, and that's time anxiety. Socialists, Psychologists, sorry, increasingly talk about time anxiety, which is distress caused by the perception that time is limited and being misused. New Year's Day is a perfect storm for time anxiety because it combines a clear boundary. You think of last year, you think of this year. You have the cultural pressure to improve. You have the awareness that you're aging, and you have the public comparison of you're looking at everybody's highlight reels. That's why social media is so dangerous, because you're comparing your life to others and their accomplishments to yours and what you did not accomplish. And you're not thinking about time, you're thinking about time running out. And that's not weakness, that's mortality awareness. And most studies show a consistent pattern. Depression increases in late December and early January. Anxiety spikes during the first 2 weeks of the year. Crisis lines and mental health services report increased contact after the holidays. And this isn't because people fail their resolutions, it happens before those resolutions begin, because the holidays temporarily suppress distress. you know, Routine disappears, social obligation distracts, all alcohol will dull your anxiety, nostalgia, mass dissatisfaction. And when January arrives, you get structure back. Your distraction disappears, your comparison begins, and the brain goes quiet enough to hear its own fear. And that's why so many suicides happen during the holidays and and all that, because you get a lot of time off during the holidays and people are kind of not thinking about the future. They're thinking about, like, breaks coming up. So not much work gets done. And humans are meaning making creatures. We don't experience time neutrally. We assign it value. So when a year ends, the brain doesn't see that 365 days have passed. It sees 365 opportunities were either used or wasted. And this activates the same neural pathways involved in social evaluation, moral judgment, rejection sensitivity. So, in other words, your brain processes the new year like you're being graded. And that's why people say things like, I didn't do enough. I wasted the year. I should be further along. I'm behind. But like, you're behind on what? You're behind on an imaginary schedule. And why this hits harder as you get older is your age intensifies that new year anxiety. So younger brains perceive time as expansive. Older brains perceive time as more contracting or constricting. And it's well documented in neuroscience that as we experience time as moving faster, we become more aware of our limitations. We measure progress more harshly. So New Year's Day stops feeling like a reset. It starts feeling like a countdown marker. Another year's gone, another number added, and the brain asks questions it cannot answer kindly. And this is why New Year's Day feels like a mirror and not a flattering one. It doesn't reflect who you are right now. It reflects who you hoped you would be, who you thought you'd be by now, and who society implied that you should be. And that reflection can be brutal, not because you failed, but because the expectations were never humane to begin with. And ancient people feared the gods would judge them at the turning of the year. Modern people fear they will be judged themselves. This is the same mechanism. It's just different vocabulary. The brain hasn't changed, only the mythology has. And this doesn't mean you're broken. Like New Year's Day triggers anxiety, sadness, or dread. And that doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It doesn't mean you're negative. It doesn't mean that you're actually failing at optimism. It means your brain is responding exactly as it evolved to respond when you're faced with evaluation, mortality, and irreversible time. Ancient people performed rituals to survive this moment. Most modern people, most people post affirmations. Both are attempts to manage the same fear. And New Year's Day hurts because it reminds us of something no culture has ever fully solved, that time moves in one direction. We don't get to rewind that time. And that realization isn't a personal flaw, it's a human one. Across cultures that never met, never traded, and never shared any language, one belief keeps appearing again and again. The first day matters more than the rest, not symbolically, not emotionally, but casually. And ancient people believed the opening moments of a cycle didn't just reflect the future, they created it. And that belief shaped behavior in ways that were obsessive, precise, and sometimes terrifying. So in ancient cultures, that first day of the year wasn't just another day, it was active time, charge time, time that behaved differently. What happened on that day was believed to spill forward, infecting everything that followed. This idea shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. So talking about old stuff again and going back to getting off my mental health rat a little bit. In Scotland, New Year's superstition took a very literal form known as first footing. The first person to cross your doorstep after midnight on New Year's. So the first person to cross your doorstep after midnight on New Year's determine your luck, your health, your prosperity, and your safety. Not metaphorically, literally. The wrong first foot was dangerous. Traditionally, the worst possible first foot was a woman, for obvious reasons, especially if it was like your mother in law. That's the worst possible first foot. A red haired man. So that's why redheads are evil. Or if someone crossed into your house empty handed. The best was a dark haired man, preferably one about 6'1", about 400 pounds, has a little bit of a beard, blue glasses, loves horror, loves pop culture, comic books, and always has a movie quote or something nice to say to you. Named Bryan. Or someone carrying coal to eat your house, bread to feed you, or whiskey. And why? Because coal means warmth, bread means food, whiskey means comfort. People would engineer who entered first in Scotland. So families would delay opening doors, neighbors would actually coordinate visits, and people waited outside in the cold to be the right first foot. Because once that first step happened, it's locked in and the year is set in motion. In Asia and in many parts of East and like Southeast Asia, New Year's customs revolve around one core idea: what you remove on the first day stays removed. So that's why sweeping on New Year's Day is forbidden. Taking out trash is avoided. Washing your hair is discouraged in some reasons, because sweeping symbolically sweeps away fortune, wealth, luck, protection. And what's fascinating is the timing, because cleaning is encouraged before the new year aggressively. Homes are scrubbed, debts are addressed, conflicts are resolved. But once the year begins, hands off. The logic is consistent. Preparation before the threshold, restraint after crossing that threshold. In ancient China, entering the new year in debt was considered profoundly dangerous, not just financially, but morally. Debts were believed to attract misfortune, disrupt harmony, and light and balance into the household. People went to extreme lengths to settle accounts before the new year. They would sell possessions, they would call in favors, they would making partial payments just to clear the ledger. Why? Because debt wasn't just money owed to the Chinese. It was unfinished business. And unfinished business at the beginning of a cycle meant the cycle is never going to stabilize. In medieval Europe, New Year's Day was watched the way we now watch hurricane forecast, actually. People observed weather conditions, animal behavior, dreams the night before. They would observe which words were spoken, which church bells rang. Chronicles record years that begin with storms, eclipses, illness, public arguments, and when disaster followed that year, the first day was always blamed. Not because people were naive, but they believed that time had a memory. And the logic behind beginnings are contagious. This isn't magical thinking, it's pattern thinking. Ancient people noticed something true, that bad starts often do lead to bad outcomes. If something starts bad, it's going to end bad. So if you begin a journey injured, you're going to struggle the whole way. If you begin a harvest late, you're going to lose yield. If you begin a war disorganized, you're going to lose ground. They generalize this into a rule, basically. The opening conditions to anything, the opening conditions matter more than later corrections. And I don't think they're wrong. They just and they apply that rule universally. So once the first day sets the tone, confirmation bias does the rest. Good year after good beginning, it's going to be good. If bad year begins, bad year has a bad beginning, it's going to be bad. Human memory is selective, and these beliefs survive because they felt correct and often enough to stick. And that's how superstitions survive, not because, it's irrational, but because it's extremely convincing. If something starts bad, it's going to end bad. If something starts good, it's going to end good. And how people talk today, they say things like, this year's already ruined. It's off to a bad start. I knew this year was cursed. I messed it up already. And that's the first day curse modernized. We don't blame spirits like the ancient people. We blame ourselves. But that logic is identical. We like to think we've evolved past this, and we haven't. We just changed the language on things. Now we say, we're going to set the tone, we're going to build momentum, we're going to stay strong, we're not going to fall behind. And motivation culture is superstitions with basically productivity branding. The belief underneath is the same. If you start wrong, you stay wrong. And this belief is hard to kill because beginnings feel permanent because they're visible, they stand out, they become reference points. So the brain returns to them again and again. And that's why one bad week in January is going to feel worse than one bad week in June. One mistake early feels heavier than many later ones. One failed resolution feels like proof of character, not really your circumstance. The beginning of your story becomes the whole story. And you can't think and live like that. Ancient people feared angering fate at the doorway of the year. Modern people fear disappointing themselves. It's the same mechanism, it's just a different costume. The first day still feels cursed, not because it is, but because we spent thousands of years teaching ourselves to believe it matters more than it really does. And one ending thing that I lived through Y2K. And at the end of the 20th century, humanity stood at that familiar edge that they did in the year 1000. We were entering a new year. We were entering a new millennium. It was a hard reset in the calendar that felt too large to be safe. And the year 2000 wasn't just another January. It was like this cliff, like a temporal cliff. And the name we gave that fear was Y2K. So Y2K felt different mainly because, it didn't scare us because of mysticism. It scared us because of mostly really infrastructure. Okay. So when computers were kind of created, basically, well, in the late 1990s, civilization had quietly handed control of banking, electric power grids, transportation, like airplanes, a bit of cars, trains, healthcare, military systems. Like we all started giving that to computers that most people didn't even understand. And and then someone realized a terrifying fact about those computers. So many of the systems only recorded years using 2 digits. So instead of 1999, they would put 99. So which meant when the clock would roll over in these computers to the year 2000, it would just say 00. And some systems would read that as 1900 or they would fail entirely. Like this wasn't science fiction, it was a design shortcut and suddenly it was everywhere. So what that meant was if at the year 2000 people believed that all technology would just stop working because this technology didn't exist in the year 1900. So if these computers told themselves it was the year 1900, they would just shut off. This was introduced in the movie Office Space, which is one of the greatest movies there is, and people really believed this, and we were terrified. Like we were genuinely terrified, and there were so many movies and shows and propaganda, and even in comic books about how scared we were about this. Like it was insane, and 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 this is where modern myth falls apart because Y2K was not dismissed by experts. It was taken very seriously in the highest levels of government. The US created a federal Y2K task force. Billions of dollars were spent rewriting this computer code. Emergency operations centers were staffed, military systems were audited, nuclear facilities ran failure simulations, banks conducted stress tests, power companies prepared for big outages, and if this were nonsense, none of that would have happened. This fear was not imaginary; it was managed. Hospitals prepared for loss of patient records, equipment failure, backup power scenarios they needed. Airlines tested navigation systems. They prepared manual override. They scheduled extra staff. Banks started printing extra cash, limited transaction exposure, prepared to halt systems if needed. Even local governments checked treatment systems. They prepared energy emergency shelters. They coordinated with civil defense offices. Like this wasn't really like completely hysteria. It was like contingency planning and media panic and like media panic and like while institutions prepared quietly, the public experienced Y2K through media amplification. Like media really amplified Y2K. Like news segments speculate about planes falling from the sky, nuclear meltdowns, traffic lights failing, ATM networks collapsing, society grinding to a halt overnight, Godzilla turning, cats and dogs living together, mass hysteria. And some of this was, of course, exaggerated. Some of it wasn't really impossible, though. And because the deadline was absolute, midnight, January 1st, we were terrified of this countdown. I remember people stockpiling food, withdrawing cash, bought generators, filled bathtubs with water, stocked survival supplies. Survivalist culture exploded. Books, VHS tapes, seminars, late night radio thrived on this anxiety. But we weren't really afraid of computers. We were really afraid of interdependence. So by 1999, society had reached a level of complexity that felt fragile. And no one person understood this whole system. You know, everyone relied on it. They relied on computers. Y2K forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth that civilization works because nothing breaks all at the same time. The new year threatened to break every single thing at once. And that's an apocalypse scenario, not because of destruction, but because of synchronization failure. And when the moment arrived, the world held its breath. I remember watching it. It's really the only thing I remember is actually watching that ball draw and and my parents freaking out. But planes stayed in the air, lights stayed on, banks didn't erase accounts, nuclear reactors didn't melt down. Too many people, Y2K became a complete and utter joke. But that interpretation misses this whole point, though. You know, nothing happened because code was rewritten, systems were tested, redundancies were added, and people worked through the night. You know, prevention succeeded. But psychologically, though, the damage or revelation was already done. People glimpsed at how close collapse could feel. And now we're all worried about AI and Terminator happening. At least maybe you should be. But if you strip away technology, Y2K does look familiar because it mirrors the year 1000 panic, apocalyptic prophecy, fear of calendar thresholds, anxiety about endings and beginnings. The fear wasn't about bugs or bugs in computers. It was about time markers that felt too important to survive unchanged. So when humans see a new century, a new millennium, a clean numerical break, we expect catastrophe because history has trained us to believe that big changes demand big consequences. Y2K had all the elements of really a religious apocalypse. A lot of people thought that the world was going to end, and this was a religious reading because it had a no date, it had a countdown, it had warnings, it had signs, it had preparations, a belief that the world would fundamentally change overnight. The only difference, though, the only difference here is God was replaced by code. Judgment was replaced by system failure. Salvation was replaced by patches and backups. But emotionally is the same story humans have told for thousands of years. And Y2K and it not happening, it didn't cure us of this apocalyptic anxiety because it really updated it. Because after Y2K, came fears of power grid failure, financial collapse, cyber warfare, infrastructure fragility, global cascading failures. The millennium taught us something unsettling, that the future doesn't need monsters to end. It needs a synchronized mistake. Y2K proves something critical about New Year's fear. Even in the most technologically advanced society in history, even with science, data, and planning, even without gods or prophecy, we fear the calendar because calendars remind us that time moves forward whether we're ready or not. And when time hits a boundary that feels too clean, too final, or too symbolic, we brace for impact. And Y2K wasn't about computers failing, really. It was about humans realizing how dependent, interconnected, and vulnerable we'd become. It was a modern echo of an ancient fear that order only exists because someone or something keeps it running. And if that stops, everything is going to stop. And, modern people like to believe that we've outgrown ritual. We think ritual belongs to temples, bonfires, priests, and ancient fears. But the truth is really simpler than that and more comfortable. We never stopped performing rituals. We just stopped calling them rituals. Midnight is not a random time to us. So let's start there at midnight, okay? There's nothing biologically special about midnight. Your body doesn't reset, your brain doesn't reboot, the world doesn't pause, and yet we treat midnight as if it does, because midnight is a threshold. And humans have always marked thresholds with ritual behavior, be it birth, death, marriage, crossing borders, changing seasons. Midnight on New Year's Eve is the largest shared threshold most people will ever experience at the same time. And that alone is enough to trigger ritual instinct. Fireworks feel celebratory, but historically, loud noise at liminal moments served a very specific purpose: to scare something away. So, across cultures, people would use drums, bells, gunfire, shouting, firecrackers. And at moments, they would use those at moments when they believed chaos, spirits, or misfortune could intrude. And the logic was simple: noise equals presence, silence equals vulnerability. Fireworks announce, we're here, we're awake, we're not vulnerable. And that's not really celebration. That is warding behavior. And fireworks also contain fire, and fire has always meant safety. Fire pushes back darkness. Fire keeps predators away. Fire creates community space. Fire signals survival. Ancient New Year festivals often involved bonfires, torches or sacred flames. Lighting up the sky at midnight is a modern version of that same impulse. We do not let darkness take over. And other things about New Year's Eve, there's always usually alcohol. And alcohol isn't just about fun. Anthropologists describe ritual intoxication as a way humans reduce fear, lower inhibition, bond socially, and avoid excessive self awareness. New Year's anxiety is introspective. Alcohol will shut that down. It dulls your self judgment. It dulls your fear of the future. It dulls your awareness of time passing. And that's why New Year's drinking is usually communal. Drinking alone is coping with stuff. But if you drink together, it's ritualized reassurance. And let's talk about that midnight kiss, which, if you got one, good for you. But the midnight kiss is one of the clearest rituals that we still practice. And it isn't romantic by accident. It's the exact moment the year turns, which uncertainty peaks at when the moment the year turns. And people instinctively seek physical connection because touch is grounding. Touch confirms presence. Touch says you're not alone right now. And ancient cultures mark transitions with hand holding, group embraces, communal meals, and some sexual symbolism. The kiss is modern shorthand for that ancient need that you want to be anchored to another human while time changes. And going into New Year's resolutions more, New Year's resolutions are not self-help tools. They're really control ritual. When a human feels powerless, they're going to respond by creating rules. They're going to make vows or promises. They're going to try establishing some form of structure to get that control back because they feel powerless. Ancient people would swear oaths to gods, but modern people swear oaths to themselves. They say, I will change. I will fix this. I will not repeat last year. And the pur- the purpose isn't improvement, it's reassurance. Resolutions say, I'm not helpless in the face of time. So whether they succeed or fail is absolutely secondary. And most resolutions do fail quickly, and not because people lack willpower, because the resolution actually already did its job. Resolution really is there to reduce anxiety in the moment. It restored a sense of agency at the threshold. Once the fear fades, the ritual is going to lose its urgency. Ancient people didn't expect rituals to last forever, really. They expected them to carry them through the transition. And even social media optimism on New Year's is this ritual behavior. People will post, "Here's to a better year. Hey, we made it. New beginnings. Grateful for another year. Here's my year in music. Here's my year in TikTok. Here's my year in photos." And this isn't branding. It's just like group reassurance. Social species survive uncertainty by checking, "Are you still here? Did you make it through? Are we okay?" And posting and scrolling on New Year's Day is like the digital equivalent of gathering around a fire. I'd rather gather around the freaking fire. and and here's the part like people don't like admitting. We don't perform these rituals because they're cute. We perform them because not performing them feels wrong. So if you skip all New Year's rituals, like you have no countdown, no acknowledgement, no message, no connection, it can, unless you're me and you're just tired, it can feel unsettling. It can feel incomplete. It can feel like leaving a door open at night. And that discomfort is an ancient feeling that's somewhat passed down. And you don't need to believe in rituals for it to work, though. Ritual can relegate emotion, anxiety, social cohesion, sense of continuity. And ancient people believe rituals kept the universe together, and modern people use them to keep themselves together. This is the same function, it's just a different scale. And calling something a ritual like implies vulnerability, fear, dependence, non-rational behavior, but modern culture prefers to control narratives. So we rename rituals as traditions, celebrations, habits, goals, and renaming them doesn't change the function though. You know, if you strip away the music, the countdown, the glitter, the post, the champagne, what remains is a group of humans standing at the edge of uncertainty, doing whatever they can feel to feel connected, protected, oriented, and less alone. And that's not really weakness. That's survival behavior. And here's the part we don't like to admit here. Hope didn't come first. Fear did. Fear is older than language. It's older than religion. It's older than history. Fear keeps humans alive long before hope. Well, fear fear kept humans alive long before hope ever even showed up. And hope wasn't born out of optimism. Hope was invented as a response to fear. Fear is a default human setting almost. Early humans didn't wake up hopeful. They woke up alert. Where's the food? Where, do we have food? Is there danger near? Is our group still intact? Is the fire still burning? Fear is functional. It sharpened attention. It kept people close to each other. It prevented reckless behavior. But hope, on the other hand, is fragile. You can only afford hope after fear has done its job. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty good thing I wrote there. You can only afford hope after fear has done its job. I do like that I wrote that. Uh, and when ancient people hoped, they didn't hope blindly. They hoped carefully. They hoped after rituals. They hoped after omens. They hoped after signs were checked and rechecked. Hope wasn't an emotion. It was like a permission. Permission granted only if fear had been addressed first. And that's why ancient New Year's rituals weren't joyful. They were preventive. And we tell ourselves New Year's transitions are about positivity, but they never were. They're about really getting through. Ancient people endured the gods, predictable, powerful, easily angered gods. Medieval people endured judgment, constant moral surveillance, eternal consequences. Modern people endure something quieter, but not really less heavily. They endure themselves. They endure their thoughts, their regrets, their unfinished lives. their sense of time is slipping faster every year. Different fears, same endurance. Hope hope has always come with terms. If the gods are appeased, if the ritual is done correctly, if judgment is delayed, if I change this time, if I don't waste another year. Hope has never been free. It has always been earned, or at least believed to be earned. And that's why hope feels fragile on New Year's Day, because it's sitting on top of fear, not replacing it. And we like to say New Year's Day is about beginnings, and historically it isn't. It's about continuation, about keeping things from getting worse, about surviving one more cycle, about holding chaos at bay for another year. Even now, when people say, I hope this year is better, what they usually mean is, I hope it's not worse. And that's not pessimism. It's realism shared by experience, really. You know, the character or sorry, the calendar the calendar flips, but fear doesn't obey calendars. Fear doesn't care if it's January 1st. It remembers what didn't work last year, what hurt you, what was lost last year, what didn't change. Fear is cumulative. It Hope has to be revealed every time you face fear. And that's why hope is effortful and fear is automatic. And here's the part that gets overlooked. Despite all this, people show up. They still gather, they still count down, they still toast, they still make plans, they still imagine a future at all. And that's not denial, that's courage. Not the loud cinematic kind, more the quiet kind. The kind that says, I'm scared, but I'm still here. And positivity says everything will be okay. Endurance says I will still be here even if it isn't. Ancient cultures understood this distinction. They didn't aim for happiness at the new year. They aimed for survival with meaning. We've lost the language for that, but not really the instinct for that. And across thousands of years, across gods, calendars, and technologies, one thing hasn't changed. New Year's Day has never been about becoming something new. It's really been like, it's really been about remaining someone at all, remaining alive, remaining connected, remaining oriented in time. And that's why the anxiety remains, because the stakes were never small. And there's something strangely comforting about this truth. It means you're not failing at New Year's. You're participating in it exactly as humans always have. Feeling the fear, carrying it forward, building hope on top of it, not instead of it. And that's not brokenness, that's inheritance. So if New Year's Day feels heavy to you, if the countdown felt hollow, if the optimism feels forced, that doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means you're responding the way humans always have. For thousands of years, people have stood at this exact threshold between what was and what might be, and felt the same tension in their chest. Some called it gods, some called it judgment, some called it fate. We call it anxiety, reflection, pressure. Different words, same feeling. We fear the future because it matters, because time matters, because what we do with it matters. And here's the part that deserves more credit than it ever gets. Even knowing all that, even carrying the fear, the doubt, the unfinished business, we still step forward. We still cross the threshold. We still imagine a tomorrow at all. And ladies and gentlemen, that's not weakness. It isn't failure. It isn't cynicism. It's survival. So if you feel uneasy on New Year's Day and this first week of the new year, you're not broken. You're human. And you're doing exactly what humans have always done. You're still here and you're still going. I encourage you that if you are feeling any sadness and if you are feeling depressed this time of year, that you reach out, to a friend, that you reach out to a therapist if you can, that you call the mental health hotlines and you talk to somebody. I'm always here for everybody, and you can reach me at gravelymusing@gmail.com. You can comment on anything. I'd be happy to talk with you guys. This became more of a mental health talk than more horror history talk, and that's okay sometimes. I love you guys, and if I didn't terrify you, if I didn't horrify you, I hope that you were gravely amused, and I hope you know that you're loved and people care about you out there. Have a wonderful New Year's. Take care, everybody.